Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about measuring behavior. Your objectives for this video are on the left, and for our agenda we're going to first talk about why it's important to take data, the general categories of collecting data, which are our indirect and direct methods. We're going to specifically talk about indirect measurement systems, then we're going to talk about dimensions of behavior, and then our direct measurement systems, and then we're going to wrap it up with some problems with observing behavior. So to get us started, why can't we just observe behavior and make judgments based off of those just everyday observations or based off of our intuitions? So to kind of examine this question, I wanted to ask you guys, who do you guys think talks more, men or women? Usually when I ask my students this, the majority of them say women, just based off of their everyday observations or their intuition. However, when we actually go in and use a scientific method and observe talking behavior and systematically collect data on it, the research actually shows that this stereotype about female talkativeness is actually unfounded. And the research even shows that in the majority of circumstances, men talk more than women. Let me ask you one more question. True or false? Our married adults are generally happier than those who are single. And when I usually ask my students this question, they typically say false. Majority of them actually have parents who are divorced because they were really unhappy in their marriage. But when we actually go in and use our scientific method, systematically observe, collect data, the research actually shows that this is true. So married adults are generally happier than those who are single. So using our basic judgments or intuitions can be good to give us an idea of a behavior that might kind of catch our eye that we need to further investigate. But those intuitions might be true, but they also might not be true. And so we really need to get in there and actually use our scientific method, systematically observe behavior, collect our data to actually determine if it is a target behavior that we need to focus on and intervene. And so measurement of our target behavior is hugely important. It can determine if treatment is even necessary or if it's even necessary to implement an intervention. You know, we're humans, and as teachers, you guys have so much going on. A kid might engage in a behavior that just kind of gets under your skin and kind of annoys you, and you might think that it's occurring a lot more than it actually is, and measuring the target behavior might actually tell you that it's only occurring every once in a while and that you actually don't need to intervene. Or the opposite could be true. You might have so much going on and you might not actually be paying attention to the behavior, and when it starts to kind of get on your radar and you actually measure it, you might realize that it's happening a lot more than you actually think it is. So it can determine if treatment is necessary, it can determine the best treatment, and it also can determine if the treatment is actually working. So after you implement an intervention, you want to continue to measure the target behavior and make sure that your behavior is increasing or decreasing like you want it to. If not, then you need to change something, because we have an ethical obligation as teachers and as behavior analysts to implement a treatment or an intervention that's effective. So in measuring the target behavior, our whole goal is to figure out what a learner's problem is and change it for the better. And we can change it for the better by measuring the target behavior, making sure that treatment is necessary, and making sure that our measurements are showing that the treatment is actually working. So we have some general categories of systems for collecting data. We have what we call indirect systems, and indirect systems are systems of measuring behavior where you're not actually directly observing the behavior. An example of this is what we call observing tangible products or permanent product recording. We also have direct observation methods where we are actually going in there and directly observing the behavior. And examples of that would be event recording, opportunity recording, interval recording, duration, and latency recording. So once again, indirect methods, you're not actually observing the behavior. Direct methods, you are actually directly observing the behavior. So let's start with our indirect methods first. So let's talk about permanent product recording. Permanent product recording is defined as measuring a behavior by its physical impact on the environment. So this is when you have a behavior that leaves something behind in the environment, something tangible that you can go back and measure at a later date. For instance, take homework, for example. You can assign kids this math worksheet and they can go home, they can do their math problems. Doing the math problems leaves an impact on the environment. It leaves something that's left behind. Their answers are left behind. They bring it in the next day and you can look at their answers and grade it and see if they got it correct or not. This is also called ex post facto measuring, where you measure something after the fact. This is really handy for situations when direct measurement is either not possible or not practical. So it's really not possible or practical to follow the kid home and watch him actually do his homework because you're a teacher and you have your own life. So, that's not a practical situation. So permanent product recording is great for homework. You can send it home, they do it on their own. Their homework leaves that impact on the environment, their answers are left behind, you can grade them at a later date. Here are some other examples of permanent product recording, more behavioral examples. So you might have kids that have severe aggression and punch the wall, and you might not be able to follow them around all the time, and it might not be practical to do that. So maybe at the end of the day, you can look in their room and see how many holes they have in their sheetrock. Punching a hole in a sheetrock leaves a tangible product that you can measure at a later date. You might have kids that have severe self-injurious behavior, biting themselves or things like that, and it could cause bruises. So you could maybe do checks, and that bruise is that tangible product. You might be able to do checks every morning or at the end of the day and see how many bruises they have on their body and measure the behavior that way. Or if you're trying to reduce smoking, it might not be practical or possible to follow the learner or the kid around all day and see how many cigarettes he smokes. But you can have them collect their cigarette butts and bring them to you at the end of the day, and you can count them and measure how many cigarettes they actually smoked. With permanent product recording, advantages is that you don't have to be continually present, which is awesome. IOA is high. IOA is our reliability check. So reliability of your measurement system is typically high. Take your cigarette butt example, for instance. Those are really easy. If somebody brings you 3 cigarette butts, you would count 3, somebody else would count 3, and those numbers will typically have high reliability and have high agreement. It's affordable and it's easy on resources. Disadvantages is that although an advantage is that you don't have to be continually present, but that's also a disadvantage as well because you're not actually directly observing the behavior. The gold standard is to directly observe the behavior. If you can directly observe it, that's what you want to do. But if you can't, and the behavior leaves a tangible product in the environment, then permanent product recording might be your best bet. But if you're not directly observing the behavior, then you don't actually know if those tangible products are a result of the behavior. Take the smoking example, for instance. The person could have maybe thrown away some cigarette butts before they presented the ones that they smoked to you, or they might include some just by off chance that somebody else smoked and they didn't actually smoke. Or those holes in the sheetrock, it could come from something else besides the kid punching the wall. And so since you didn't exactly observe the behavior, you don't really know. You can't use it if the behavior doesn't leave something behind. It may reduce reliability and validity of the recording because of the reasons that I just talked about with you not being actually able to directly observe the behavior. And then because you're not directly observing it, you don't know what's happening in the environment when the behavior occurs. So you're not going to know the antecedents and consequences of the actual behavior. So that's one indirect method. We actually use indirect methods or permanent product recording a lot in the educational setting because teachers are so busy and they might not be able to actually directly observe the behavior at all times. So, if you have a kid that likes to, I don't know, throw pencils on the floor, for example, you might not be able to watch him the whole class period and count how many pencils he throws on the floor. But throwing pencils on the floor leaves something tangible that you can record at a later date. So when all the kids file out of your classroom, you can go back around that kid's desk and pick up the pencils that he threw on the floor and count them that way. All right, our next measurement system is direct observation. So you are actually going in there and directly observing the behavior. With direct observation, before we talk about the different systems, I wanted to talk about the dimensions of behavior. So these are how you're going to actually quantify the behavior. You can measure frequency, so the number of occurrences of a behavior. How many times does it occur during your observation period? You can measure rate. Rate is the frequency of a behavior during a period of time. So 8 instances per minute, 8 instances per hour, 8 instances per day. If you have that period of time per minute, per hour, per day, it's typically rate. And the difference between frequency and rate, and whenever you decide to use either one of these, it depends on your observation period. If you're going to observe for the same time each observation period, so maybe you observe for an hour on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you're observing for the same number of time, for the same amount of time, so you can just measure frequency and compare your frequency numbers across observations. But if you observe for different observation periods, or different amount of observation period, if your observation period time is different each time, then you have to convert your frequency into rate. So if you observe for 30 minutes on Monday, an hour on Wednesday, and 30 minutes on Friday, then you can't use frequency because you might get a higher frequency number on Wednesday than you did on Monday or Friday, and that would be because you're observing for a longer period of time. So you have to convert your frequency into rate if the length of your observation periods are not equal. And when you convert it into rate, that gives you a standardized measurement that you can compare across your observation times. You can measure duration, which is the amount of time the individual engages in a behavior. How long is the child talking to their friends? How long is the child crying? Things like that. Latency is the length of time between the instructional cue and the occurrence of the behavior. So how long does it take the kid to actually engage in the behavior after the teacher gives instruction? When the teacher tells the kid to sit down, how long does it take for the kid to actually sit? And then the last dimension that you might use, you're going to use frequency, rate, duration, and latency the most, but you guys might use force, which is the intensity or magnitude of the behavior. So if a kid is pushing another kid, how forcefully does he push the kid? If the kid bangs his fist on the desk, how intense is that banging? What's the magnitude of the behavior? And that's what we mean by force. Okay, so with our direct observation systems, we have continuous and discontinuous systems. With continuous, this means that during your observation period, you're going to observe during the whole observation period, and you're either going to measure how many times the behavior occurs, how long the behavior occurs, the latency or the intensity within the whole observation period. And with our continuous observation systems, we have what we call event recording. Event recording is, like I said, a continuous recording for discrete behaviors. With event recording, you're measuring the frequency. And because you're measuring the frequency, you typically want to use a short duration behavior, or you want to measure a short duration behavior. And it needs to be discrete, so it needs to have a very clear start and a very clear stop. So behaviors that are not appropriate for event recording are behaviors that occur at a really, really high frequency. Remember, you're measuring frequency, and if they occur at a really, really high frequency, it can be really hard to tally each one of those behaviors. And so if you think about the number of steps taken during running and you watch somebody run, it might be really hard to tally all of those steps because the person is moving so fast. Also not appropriate for behaviors in which the occurrence of the behavior can last for long periods of time. So we call those long duration behaviors, which is not appropriate for event recording. So event recording, you're measuring frequency. It's a continuous recording procedure, so you're watching the child throughout the whole observation period. If your observation period is an hour, you're watching the child the whole hour. And it's for discrete behaviors, so behaviors that you can very clearly tell when they happen. They have a clear start and a clear stop. Short duration, discrete behaviors. Okay, with event recording, we're going to practice it. So in your module, you guys have a measurement activity
Grammarly
document.
can help you write quickly and confidently, so you never have to slow down at work. Stay on top of emails.
Okay, so I want you guys to open that document, and I'm going to put my video right here and put this document right next to it, and we're going to do this together. So with event recording, what you're going to do, is we're going to watch this video, and our observation period for this video, since we're just practicing, is going to be 1.5 minutes. When you guys actually observe in the real world, in the educational setting, it would probably be 30 minutes or an hour, something like that. It might be as short as 10 to 15 minutes, but it's probably not going to be 1.5 minutes. But for the purposes of this activity, we're going to observe for 1.5 minutes. And remember, it's a frequency recording, and so we're going to observe the whole 1.5 minutes, and we're going to tally every time the guy engages in a silly walk. And we are defining a silly walk as any time a leg is lifted above the hips. So I'm going to press play, and every time the behavior occurs, I'm going to put a little tally. So let's get started.
Time, please. Oh, yes, I have. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so he lifted his leg above his hip, so I'm going to put a tally mark. It happened once again, so I'm going to tally. There was another instance, so we're going to put a tally mark. Another one. Another one. And from here on out, I'm just going to let the video play, and I'm just going to tally whenever the silly walk occurs.
Good morning. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, but I'm afraid my walk has become rather sillier recently, and so it takes me rather long. Now then, what was it again?
Well, sir, I have a silly walk, and I'd like to obtain a government grant to help me develop it.
Okay, so that's 1.5 minutes. So we have observed during our whole observation period, put our tallies, and now we need to count them and get our total occurrences or our frequency. So I recorded 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And you guys might have recorded 12 or 14. We're humans and we're recording, so whenever you guys do this, it's really good to have reliability checks and make sure that you're recording the same number as somebody else, or that they agree as much as possible. So we're going to put our frequency right here, and for the purposes of this activity, we're going to convert it into rate. Remember, if your observation period is the same, then you can leave it as frequency, but if it's not, then you want to convert it into rate. So with rate, you're going to take how many minutes, and we observed for 1.5 minutes, so 1.5 minutes. And to calculate the rate, you're going to do the frequency divided by the number of minutes. So 13 divided by 1.5. And let's get our calculator over here. So we're going to do 13 divided by 1.5. And that gives us 0.866. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Alright, sorry guys. I think my calculator messed up. So we're doing 13 divided by 1.5. I don't think that point got in there. So 8.6. So we have, we're going to round that up to 9. So 9 instances per minute. So that gives us our rate. So that is event recording. And let's see, go back to... Okay, advantages, it's accurate, it's easy. Disadvantages is that it's time consuming because you have to watch throughout the whole observation period and put a tally every time the behavior occurs. Alright, in addition to event recording, another continuous method is opportunity recording. And this is when, for the behavior to occur, there has to be an opportunity for the behavior to occur. And then you mark down whether the child responded correctly or not. So, for instance, asking the kids questions in class, giving them opportunities to respond, essentially. And then you would record whether they responded correctly or incorrectly to your question. Homework problems, that math worksheet that I showed you guys earlier, that would be an opportunity to respond, or opportunity recording, and that they're not just going to write a number down. They have to have a math problem, which gives them an opportunity to respond, and then you record correct or incorrect. There's also duration recording, so you can record during the observation period. You would have a timer, and when the behavior started, you would start the timer. When the behavior ended, you would end it, and you would have, within an hour, the behavior might have occurred for a total duration of 20 minutes or something like that. And here's an example of a duration data sheet. And I know it's kind of hard to read, it's kind of fuzzy, but basically the behavior is off-task behavior. So they're recording when Stan looks away from instruction, stops working in the presence of an assignment, or talks with peers during word time without permission. And so you can see you have the date here, and the observation period, I think, is the whole day. And so basically at 9:06, he starts becoming off task, and he's off task until 9:22, which was 36 minutes. Then he becomes off task at 11:15 to 1:36. I might not be reading that right. Oh, they have the total duration as 21 minutes. 12:10 to 12:16, total duration 6 minutes. And then 1:12 to 1:30, which is 18 minutes. So you add these together, and you can either get an average duration or total number of minutes that the kid engaged in off-task behavior. And then there's latency recording. So you can measure the amount of time it took from the teacher giving the instruction for the kid to actually engage in the behavior. And here's an example of a latency recording form. So the teacher instructed the kids to begin work at 8:35, and the behavior was initiated 33 seconds later. So latency was 33 seconds. Then the next day, we got 8:35, and the behavior was initiated at 8:37. So it took 2 minutes and 5 seconds. And then the next instance, 28 seconds. And you can get an average latency score with these behaviors. And then here's just another data sheet. So just to remind you guys, with duration, when the response starts, so when the response ends, so when the behavior starts and when it ends, that would be your duration. And you can get, like I said, total duration or average duration. Typically it's average duration. Or you can do latency, so delivery of the instruction and when the response or the behavior is initiated. And so that would give you your latency data. And you typically get average latency, or I don't think you would do total, you'd probably do average. Okay, so those are examples of your continuous measurement systems where you have an observation period and you record continuously throughout the observation period. The other type of, so continuous is good. It gives you the most accurate representation of the data. However, it's very time consuming. And as teachers, you might not be able to actually watch the kid and record, do event recording or do duration recording. And because you have 20 other kids in your classroom and you're doing so many different things. So when that's the case, you can use discontinuous recording methods. And this is what we call interval recording. So our last method on this slide is the interval recording. So with interval recording, what you're doing is you're taking an observation period and you're dividing it into a number of short intervals. And then you're going to record whether the behavior occurs or doesn't occur during that interval. This is a discontinuous recording procedure. So we have 3 different types of interval recording, and with each of these, you once you record if the behavior has occurred or not, then you really don't have to watch the whole observation period. There are parts during the observation period where you can attend to other kids and do other things. So first I wanted to, and these are really good with, interval recording systems are good to use with behaviors that are continuous, so more long duration behaviors, and also high frequency behaviors. Remember, you don't want to use, if you're doing continuous recording, event recording, you don't want to do that with high frequency behaviors, but you can use interval recording systems for those high frequency behaviors. So there's 3 that we're going to talk about. The first one we're going to talk about is partial interval recording. And this is when you're going to record whether a behavior occurred at any time during the interval. So you have maybe 10-second intervals or 20-second intervals, and if the behavior occurs at all during that interval, you put a plus, and then you can attend to other kids until the next interval starts. So if the behavior occurs at all, even at least once during the interval gets a plus. If the behavior doesn't occur at all, the interval gets a minus. So I want you guys to click on the PIR, or partial interval, and it's going to pull up a Friends video. And I want you guys to get out your measurement activity again. We're going to put it right next to each other. Okay, so now we're going to practice our partial interval recording. And we're going to record every time any one of the characters or friends bumps their fists together 2 times. So bumping together 2 times is 1 instance. So we're going to start the video, and these are 10-second intervals. And so in the first 10 seconds, if the behavior occurs at all, we're going to put a plus. And I'm going to go through this with you guys. So let's do our first interval. Okay, so the behavior occurred, so we are going to put a plus. So let's go to our next interval.
What was that?
Monica knows.
It's a way of giving the finger without actually having to give it.
Okay, so I did not see the behavior occurred, so got a minus. Let's go to our next interval. Okay, so it occurred within the first 2 seconds of this third interval. So we're going to put a plus, and now we can attend to our other kids or do something else until the 4th interval comes up. So we'll just watch it until then.
Sometimes it's who?
Sometimes it's...
Okay, so now we're on to our 4th interval, and remember, you just put a plus if it occurs. So it actually occurred twice in that interval, but we had already put a plus at the very beginning of that interval when it occurred, so we're good for the rest of it. So now 4th interval.
Sorry, Joey, as long as he's here and he's conscious, we're still shooting.
Okay, so it occurred, Then we're going to put a plus and go to the next interval.
I'm going to go get ready.
When you make out the card, be sure
Okay, so it occurred during that interval.
to make it out to Emily.
Okay, so it occurred, so we put a plus. Here's our next interval. It's occurring a lot, so we're putting a plus. And here's our last interval. And we're going to go till 26. Alright, so that is partial interval recording. Oh, it didn't happen the last interval, sorry guys. And to calculate this, so you're going to put in how many intervals the behavior occur, and you're going to count up your pluses, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 here. How many total intervals? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 here, and then we're going to divide the number of intervals in which the behavior occurred by the total and multiply it by 100. So we get our little calculator out, just so you guys can see it. 6 divided by 8 times 100, which gives us a 75%. So during our observation period, the behavior is occurring approximately 75% of the time. Okay. Advantages of partial interval recording: you don't have to observe the rest of the interval after the behavior occurs. So in one of those intervals, I think Rachel did the behavior at the very beginning. We put a plus, we can go on and do other things until the next interval comes around. Disadvantages is that it actually overestimates the total duration of behavior. So, if the behavior could actually occur, if we look back at our data, it could have occurred once in every single one of these intervals, which would result in a plus in all these intervals, and which would result in the approximation of the behavior occurring 100% of the whole observation period, even though it might have only occurred 8 times. So partial interval recording is going to overestimate the occurrence of the behavior. All right. Our next interval recording system is whole interval recording, and this is when the observer only records the behavior if it occurs during the entire interval. So this is more for long duration behaviors. If the behavior occurs during the whole interval, there's a plus. If it occurs for half of it and then stops, it's a minus. So the behavior has to occur for the entire interval to get a plus. So let's practice whole interval recording. And so let's see. I want you guys to click on the whole interval record video, and this video will come up. And then let's get our paper right here. Okay, so now we're doing whole interval recording, and this video is a boy seeking attention through tantruming. And we are going to operationally define tantruming as a child falling on the floor and or crying. So you'd actually, for the purposes of this video, you don't have to see the child in the view. When the camera goes off the child, if you can still hear him crying, then that still counts as him engaging in the behavior. These are 5-second intervals, so a little shorter than 10-second. So remember, for whole interval, the behavior has to occur for the whole interval for us to get a plus. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we see him, he's on the floor, he's crying the whole interval, so he gets a plus. Okay, so we don't see him, the camera goes off of him, and we can hear him, but the last 2 seconds of the interval, he stops crying. So he did not engage in the behavior the whole time, so we get a minus. Okay, let's go to the next interval. So he's kind of crying, and I think he stops throughout it, so we're going to go ahead and put a minus. So, because he's not crying throughout the whole interval. So let's go to the next one. Okay, once again, the first couple of seconds, he wasn't crying or on the floor, so we're going to put a minus. Oh. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, he's engaging in the behavior the whole 5 seconds, so we get a plus. And last interval. Okay, so that one might be subject to interpretation. I think he kind of, I guess I could hear him crying the whole time, so I'm going to put a plus, but you guys might interpret that as a minus. But okay, so now let's calculate this. And how many intervals of the behavior occurred? So count up your pluses. I got 3. And how many total intervals? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so calculate it the same way. We're going to do 3 divided by 6 times 100. And that gives us 50%. So the behavior is occurring 50% of the observation period. All right. So let me go back. Sorry guys, trying to navigate these videos. Okay. So remember, whole interval recording has to occur for the whole interval to get a plus. Good for high rate behaviors that you can't discretely count. Good for long duration behaviors. Disadvantages is that it underestimates the occurrence of the behavior. So he was really, I would say the majority of the time, actually crying or falling on the floor. But because he didn't do it for the whole interval, we had a lot of intervals that had minuses. And so we only showed him with in a whole interval recording engaged in the behavior approximately 50% of the time. So it actually underestimates. So partial interval recording is going to overestimate behavior. Whole interval recording is going to underestimate. The last one is momentary time sampling. And this is when you're going to record whether the behavior is occurring at the moment when the interval ends. So you can do whatever you want to when the interval ends. You might have a timer on your little belt or on you that goes off. You check if the kid's engaging in the behavior, you put a plus. If not, you put a minus. You go on about whatever it is that you're doing for the rest of the interval, for the new interval until it gets to the very end. Then you check the kid's engaging in the behavior at the end, you put a plus. If not, you put a minus. So go ahead and click on the momentary time sampling link. And it's going to pull up a little video of a baby laughing. And so we'll get our little activity sheet. And this time we're going to use momentary time sampling to record laughing. So anytime the baby laughs, well, the behavior is the baby laughing. We're in 10-second intervals. So basically, you guys can watch the video at the end of the 10 seconds. I'm going to pause it. If the baby is laughing at the very end, at the end of the interval, we put a plus. If not, we put a minus. So let's try this one. Okay, baby's laughing at that 10-second mark, so we put a plus. Let's do the next interval. Okay, baby was laughing at the 20-second mark, so we put a plus. Okay, baby was laughing at a 30-second mark, so we put a plus. Alright, I would say baby was laughing at the end of that 40-second mark. I would say baby was still laughing at the end of that interval.
Look at this one, Micah.
Okay, baby's not laughing at the 1 minute mark, so we're going to put a minus and go to the next interval.
Look at this one.
Okay, baby's not laughing at that 10-second mark. It starts laughing at 11 seconds, but not at the 10. Not laughing at the 20, so we're going to put another minus. Okay, and then we're going to calculate how often the behavior occurs the same way. So count your pluses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 divided by our total number of intervals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times 100. So let's get our calculator over here. And we're going to do 5 divided by 8 times 100. And that gives us about 63% of the time. So that is momentary time sampling. Not say that. For momentary time sampling, the advantage is that you don't have to attend to the behavior except at the end of the interval. So other than that, you can deal with other kids, you can do the other things that you need to in your classroom. And it actually does a really good job of estimating behavior, so that's pretty cool. And you typically usually with momentary time sampling, the intervals are a little bit longer. And so with that, sometimes it does overestimate or underestimate when the intervals are greater than 2 minutes. But usually with momentary time sampling, you are going to have intervals that are kind of greater than 2 minutes. If you have smaller intervals like 10 seconds or 30 seconds, then you're more often going to use either partial interval or whole interval. Momentary time sampling for observation periods that are longer, so your intervals are a little longer. All right, and I have this just to give you guys another example of all three of these methods of these interval recording. So when you see the line go up and it being shaded, that's when the behavior is occurring. So remember, partial interval recording, if the behavior occurs at all during the interval, we put a plus. So if we look at this first interval, it's definitely occurring, so we get a plus. Second interval, it definitely occurs at least once, so put a plus. Third interval, it doesn't occur. Fourth interval, it occurs at least once. Fifth interval, it occurs. And sixth interval, it occurs. Now with whole interval recording, we want to make sure you only get a plus in the interval if the behavior occurs within the whole interval. If it stops at all, you get a minus. So with our first interval, it occurs on the whole thing, so we get a plus. The second interval, it stops, so we get a minus. It doesn't occur during the third interval, so minus. It doesn't occur during the whole interval for the fourth one, so you get a minus. It does occur for the whole interval for the fifth one, and it stops here at the very end for the last one, so we get a minus, and that it doesn't occur for the whole interval. And then with momentary time sampling, we're just looking at the very end. So at the very end, the behavior is occurring, get a plus. Behavior is occurring at the very end, so we get a plus. Behavior is not occurring at the very end, so we get a minus. Behavior is occurring at the very end, so we get a plus. Behavior is occurring at the very end, and behavior is not occurring at the very end. So that's kind of how those three different systems work. And then remember when we talked about the advantages and disadvantages, we talked about how partial interval recording can overestimate behavior and whole interval recording can underestimate behavior. So if we look at how often the behavior actually occurs, so if we take a duration recording, we actually see that the behavior occurs about 65% of the time. So now let's look at partial interval recording. We do the number of pluses, so 5 divided by the number of intervals times 100, and that gives us about 83%. So we can see here that partial interval recording is overestimating how much the behavior actually occurs. With whole interval recording, we only said it only got a plus in 2 intervals, so 2 divided by 6 times 100, and therefore the behavior is estimated to occur approximately about 33% of the time during the interval. So you can see that that really underestimates the amount of behavior that is actually occurring. And then momentary time sampling, we talked about how that's actually pretty accurate. So with this one, you get 4 divided by 6 times 100, which is 67, which actually accurately describes how often the behavior occurs. So I just wanted to show you guys that, kind of recap those three systems, and once again, let you guys realize that partial interval might overestimate the behavior, whole interval might underestimate it. Alright, this is in your module, and I just wanted to briefly go over it. It kind of guides you guys into choosing a data collection method. So you can look at these types of behaviors on the left. If the behavior does not occur that often, then you can use frequency or rate. If the behavior occurs for long periods of time and it has a clear start and stop, you can use duration. If the behavior occurs at high frequency, you can use interval, typically partial interval recording. If the behavior occurs constantly, then you can use interval recording. If the student is presented with opportunities to engage in appropriate behavior, that's when you want to use your opportunity recording. So you guys can look through this on your own and just it just guides you into a specific data collection method. Also, I like to have kind of visual representations of the data, and there's an article in your module by LeBlanc, and she gives this flowchart, which I think is really cool. We talked about continuous recording and how that's kind of the best type of recording because you get the most accurate representation of the data because you're continually monitoring the learner and when the problem behavior occurs. But it is also, although it's the best, it's also really time consuming. So you might not have the resources, or it might not be practical for you to actually continuously observe during the observation period. So really looking at, you know this is the best way, but do you actually have the resources? What's the most practical way to actually do this? And that brings all those together. So at the top here you have, can you actually observe the problem behavior? If you can't, does it produce that tangible, does it produce a tangible change in the environment, something that you can measure at a later date? If so, you can use your permanent product recording. If not, then you need to brainstorm with your supervisor another way to measure the behavior. If you can observe the behavior, so you're going to use a direct observation system, then you need to figure out, is the behavior discrete and countable? Discrete meaning it has a clear start and stop. If it's not discrete and countable, then you need to figure out, can you actually continually monitor the behavior? If you can, use partial interval recording. If you can't, momentary time sampling. If we go back up here, if you say that the problem behavior is discrete and countable, then that's when you want to look at, that's when you're getting into, okay, it's discrete and countable. You can use the continuous measure, but do you actually have the resources to count each instance? If you don't, can you actually monitor the behavior? If so, partial. If not, momentary time sampling. If you do have the resources to count each instance, then you want to look at, can the problem behavior occur at any time? If you need if the teacher has to present an opportunity for it to recur, for the problem behavior to occur, then it can't happen at any time because the teacher has to present that opportunity. So in that case, you would use your opportunity recording. But if the problem behavior can occur at any time, then you can use any one of your kind of dimensions of behavior depending upon if you're looking at frequency or duration recording or latency recording or intensity recording. So once again, I really like this flowchart. It tells you which measurement system to use, and it takes into account your resources and the practicality of each of the systems. Alright, there are a couple problems with recording behavior, and I'm just going to talk about the main one. And the main one is what we call reactivity. So this is when the person doesn't actually engage in the behavior because they know somebody's observing them. And I like to give the example of dancing. So when you're in your house by yourself, you probably dance all around. But the second somebody comes in and is watching you or is there, then you're probably not going to dance anymore. And the same thing happens with behavior. So how can we reduce that? And one way to reduce it is before you actually go in to measure the behavior, you can start going in there and actually watching the learner, and the learner will get used to you being there and will start to eventually behave naturally. And then I have the question, is it always bad? And the answer is no. So if you're doing any type of self-monitoring, sometimes you might teach your kids to self-monitor, or you might self-monitor your own behavior. The fact that you are actually monitoring the behavior actually might cause it to increase or decrease in the way that you want it to. So simply just with self-monitoring, reactivity isn't always bad because the behavior can change in ways that are more appropriate just from the fact of you being aware of your own behavior. So, alright guys, we talked about the importance of taking data. We talked about general categories of collecting data. If you don't directly observe the behavior, you're going to use an indirect. If you directly observe the behavior, you're going to use a direct observation system. We talked about those indirect systems, which is your permanent product recording. We talked about the dimensions of behavior, frequency, rate, duration, latency, and force. We talked about our direct measurement systems, so event recording, opportunity recording, duration recording, latency recording, and then we talked about interval recording. And then we talked about the main problem with observing behavior, which is that reactivity. Alright guys, please let me know if you have any questions as you're going through this video or you're doing the measurement activity, and thanks for listening.